I was brewing my second pot of coffee when I heard the pounding on my front door, the kind that makes your gut drop, because you know it's about to be some HOA nonsense. Sure enough, there stood Brenda Patterson, clipboard in hand, wearing her signature pearl necklace and that look of barely contained rage that seemed to be her default expression. "Connor Kimball, we need to talk about your mailbox," she announced before I could even say good morning. I glanced at my perfectly regulation black mailbox with the brushed nickel numbers. "What about it?" "The post is 3 inches too far left according to the revised HOA guidelines from last month. It was barely 7 in the morning on a Saturday." I'd moved to Meadowbrook Estates in suburban Indianapolis 2 years ago, thinking the planned community would be peaceful and well-maintained. What I got instead was Brenda and her committee of busybodies who measured blade heights and debated paint swatches like they were negotiating international treaties. "Brenda, it's in the exact same spot it's been since I moved in." "Then you'll need to move it by Tuesday or face a $200 fine." She made a note on her clipboard with an aggressive flourish. That's when Marcus Chen from across the street jogged over, still in his running gear. "Hey, Connor, you seeing this too?" "Seeing what?" He pulled out his phone and showed me a picture. "There's a survey crew at the entrance to the neighborhood. Been there since 6 this morning." Brenda's eyes narrowed. "A survey crew? No one authorized any surveying work." "That's because the county sent them," Marcus said. I asked. "Something about verifying property lines for the new tax assessment." For once, Brenda looked uncertain. She clutched her clipboard tighter. "Well, I'll have to investigate this immediately. This better not interfere with the spring beautification project." She marched off toward her white BMW, heels clicking on the driveway. I should have known that survey crew was the first domino in what would become the most insane 6 months of my life. By Monday morning, everyone in Meadowbrook Estates had heard about the survey team. Our neighborhood Facebook group, normally full of lost cat posts and arguments about Christmas light dates, was exploding with speculation. The surveyors had been back every day, walking the perimeter of the subdivision with their equipment, taking notes, and refusing to answer questions. I was finishing up a work call in my home office when my phone buzzed with about 15 notifications at once. The Facebook group was going nuclear. Someone had posted a blurry photo of official-looking documents. "Emergency HOA meeting tonight 7 p.m. Community Center," Brenda had written in all caps. The community center was packed when I arrived at 6:45. Every seat was taken, and people lined the walls. I spotted Marcus saving me a spot near the middle. The room buzzed with anxious energy. "You hear anything?" I asked him. "Just rumors. Something about the county finding discrepancies in property records." Brenda entered exactly at 7, flanked by the other board members. Gerald Henderson, the treasurer who always wore bow ties, and Patricia Morris, the secretary who'd once cited someone for having the wrong shade of white on their shutters. They all looked pale. Brenda didn't even bother with her usual lengthy preamble about HOA rules and community standards. "I'm going to be direct. The county surveyor's office contacted me this afternoon with some extremely concerning information regarding our subdivision." The room went silent. "It appears there may be irregularities in the original deed records from when Meadowbrook Estates was developed in 1998. "What kind of irregularities?" someone called out. Gerald stepped forward, adjusting his bow tie nervously. "The streets, the common areas. According to the county, they were never properly deeded to anyone. Not to the county, not to the HOA, not to individual property owners." The room erupted. Everyone started talking at once. I sat there trying to process what that even meant. Marcus leaned over. "How is that possible?" The developer, Greenfield Properties, apparently went bankrupt in 2001, Patricia said, raising her voice to be heard over the chaos. There are supposed to be documents transferring ownership of the common areas and streets to the HOA as part of the final plat. Those documents either were never filed or were filed incorrectly and never caught. So who owns the streets? Demanded Robert Fuller, who lived on Maple Drive. Technically, no one, Gerald said. They're in a legal gray area. The county assumed the HOA owned them. The HOA assumed the county had accepted them as public roads, but neither is true. Brenda regained control of the meeting. Now, everyone needs to remain calm. We've already contacted the HOA's attorney and he's looking into our options. What about our property values? Someone shouted. What about maintenance? Another voice added. Can we even sell our houses if the streets don't legally exist? That question seemed to hit everyone at once. The panic in the room intensified. I raised my hand. What exactly did the attorney say so far? Brenda's jaw tightened. He said it's complicated and he needs time to research. But in the meantime, we need to determine who's responsible for maintaining these streets, snow removal, repairs, and who has legal liability if someone gets hurt on them. We've been paying HOA dues for years specifically for street maintenance, Marcus pointed out. Where's that money? Gerald pulled out a financial report. The HOA has approximately $47,000 in reserves. But if we're not actually the legal owners of the streets, we may not have the authority to maintain them. And if someone sues over a pothole or accident, the liability could fall on individual homeowners rather than the HOA entity. That sent a fresh wave of panic through the crowd. The meeting lasted until nearly 10 o'clock, with Brenda trying to maintain order while homeowners vented their fears and frustrations. By the end, the board had agreed to bring in a real estate attorney specializing in property law, and to request all original documents from the county and the developer's bankruptcy proceedings. As everyone filed out, I heard fragments of worried conversations. I was supposed to close on the sale of my house next month. How do we refinance if the property title is clouded? My parents are in one of those reverse mortgages. What does this mean for them? I walked home with Marcus, both of us processing the bombshell. This is insane, Marcus said. How does an entire subdivision just forget to properly deed its own streets? Bureaucratic incompetence mixed with a bankrupt developer, I said. Recipe for disaster. Brenda's going to lose her mind, Marcus laughed, though there was no humor in it. She can't fine people for mailbox violations when the streets they're on don't legally exist. Don't give her ideas. She'll probably try anyway. Over the next week, the situation went from concerning to surreal. The story hit the local news after someone tipped off a reporter from the Indianapolis Star. Suddenly, we had news vans parked at the entrance to Meadowbrook Estates, interviewing residents about living in a neighborhood where the infrastructure existed in a legal void. The HOA's attorney, a sharp-looking woman named Rachel Morrison, attended the next board meeting to explain our options. I made sure to be there. The situation is unusual but not unprecedented, Rachel explained, standing at the front of the community center with a PowerPoint presentation. When developers go bankrupt before completing the platting process, these things can fall through the cracks. The issue is that Meadowbrook Estates is a private subdivision, so the county never had an obligation to accept the streets as public roads. But the HOA was never properly granted ownership either. So what do we do? Brenda asked, looking more frazzled than I'd ever seen her. You have several options. First, you could petition the county to accept the streets as public roads, which would transfer all maintenance and liability to them. Second, You could try to formally establish HOA ownership through an adverse possession claim or a quiet title action. Third, you could try to track down the bankruptcy estate of Greenfield Properties and see if there are any remaining assets or unclear transfers that could be sorted out. "What's the best option?" Gerald asked. "That depends on what you want. If the county takes the streets, you lose control over them. No more HOA rules about parking, no control over repairs or aesthetics. But you also lose the liability and maintenance costs. If the HOA takes ownership, you maintain control but also all the responsibility and legal exposure." "How much will this cost?" someone called out. Rachel didn't sugarcoat it. "A quiet title action could run anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000 in legal fees, potentially more if it's contested. The petition to the county would be cheaper, maybe $10,000 to $15,000, but there's no guarantee they'd accept the streets. They might not meet current county standards for public roads." The room groaned collectively. Our HOA dues were already $400 a quarter. Then Marcus asked the question I'd been thinking. "What if we do nothing?" Rachel paused. "That's technically an option, though I wouldn't recommend it. You'd continue in the current gray area. The risk is that individual homeowners could face liability for injuries on the streets. Title insurance companies might refuse to insure property sales, and refinancing could become difficult or impossible. Plus, without clear ownership, no one has clear authority to maintain the streets, which creates a tragedy of the commons situation." "We're already seeing that," Patricia said. "I've gotten calls from 3 different paving companies asking who's authorized to approve the repaving bid for Oakmont Circle. I don't know what to tell them." Brenda stood up, straightening her blazer. "We'll need to put this to a vote. All homeowners should have a say in how we proceed." That's when things got really interesting. The HOA scheduled a full community vote for 3 weeks out, giving everyone time to review the options and the cost implications. In the meantime, daily life in Meadowbrook Estates started to unravel in weird ways. First, the trash collection company sent a notice that they were suspending service pending clarification of contractual authority. Apparently, their contract was with the HOA for collection on private streets, but without clear ownership of those streets, their legal department had concerns. Then the streetlights started going out. The power company maintained them under an agreement with the HOA, but half the lights in the subdivision were now dark because they wouldn't send repair crews without proof of who owned the poles. "This is ridiculous," I told Marcus as we stood in my driveway watching a tow truck haul away someone's car. The county sheriff had come through and started ticketing cars for parking on streets that, according to them, might be private property where the county parking ordinances didn't apply. "It gets better," Marcus said. "My neighbor got into an accident at the entrance yesterday. Fender bender, no big deal. But now both insurance companies are arguing about whose policy covers it because they can't determine if it happened on a public or private road." I ran my hands through my hair. How did nobody catch this for 28 years? Because everyone assumed someone else had handled it. The county assumed the HOA owned the streets. The HOA assumed they were on county easements or something. All the title companies and lawyers who handled our house sales just copied the same mistake forward. That night, I did something I should have done earlier. I pulled out all my closing documents from when I bought the house. I spread them across my dining room table and started reading through the dense legal language. My property deed clearly described the boundaries of my lot. It referenced the plat map of Meadowbrook Estates recorded in 1998. But nowhere did it mention ownership of the streets, sidewalks, or common areas. There was an addendum about HOA covenants and restrictions, but those were about rules, not property ownership. I called my real estate agent who'd helped me buy the place. She was defensive at first, then confused, then worried as I explained the situation. Connor, I've sold dozens of homes in Meadowbrook Estates. This was never an issue. The title company always cleared everything. Did they, though? Or did they just verify that the property lines were clear and assume everything else was standard? She promised to look into it and get back to me. When she called back the next day, she sounded shaken. I spoke with the title company. They're convening an emergency meeting of their legal team. If this affects property sales, they could be looking at errors and omissions claims from hundreds of transactions over the years. The local news story had grown legs. By the end of the second week, we had reporters from Chicago and Cincinnati covering the neighborhood that doesn't legally exist. Property law professors from Indiana University were giving interviews about the implications. Real estate blogs were having a field day with headlines like HOA horror story, when your streets belong to no one. And through it all, Brenda Patterson was losing her grip on control. I was trimming my hedges when she stormed up to me, clipboard in hand. "Connor Kimball, your grass is half an inch over the regulation height." I set down my trimmer. "Brenda, we're in the middle of a crisis about whether our streets legally exist and you're measuring grass." "Standards must be maintained," she said, her voice rising. "If we let things slip now, this neighborhood will descend into chaos. Look around, Brenda. We're already in chaos. Half the streetlights are out, trash is piling up on Sycamore Lane, and there's a pothole on Birch Drive big enough to swallow a motorcycle." "None of that is my fault," she snapped. "I've been working tirelessly to maintain order and property values while everyone panics." "Maybe if you'd been paying attention to actual important things instead of mailbox angles and grass height, someone would have caught this years ago." Her face went red. "How dare you? I volunteer countless hours for this community. I've served on the board for 8 years. And in those 8 years, did you ever actually verify that the HOA owned what it claimed to own?" She opened her mouth, closed it, then marched away, heels clicking angrily on the sidewalk. Marcus had watched the whole thing from his porch. That was brutal. Someone needs to say it. "We're paying her and the board to manage our common property, and it turns out we don't even own it." "Speaking of which," Marcus said, walking over, "did you hear about the petition?" "What petition?" Group of homeowners on the east side started a petition to dissolve the HOA entirely. "They're arguing that if we don't actually own the streets, then the HOA has no purpose and no authority, so why are we paying dues?" That afternoon, I found the petition posted in the neighborhood Facebook group. Already had over 100 signatures. The arguments in the comments were fierce. Some people wanted to keep the HOA and fix the ownership issue. Others wanted to burn the whole thing down and let the county take over. A third faction wanted to maintain private ownership but completely replace the board. The community meeting about the vote turned into a shouting match. Brenda tried to present the options rationally. "We have 3 choices. Option 1. We pursue a quiet title action to establish HOA ownership, estimated cost $50,000. Option 2. We petition the county to accept the streets as public roads, estimated cost $15,000 but with no control over future maintenance or rules. Option 3. We do nothing and accept the risks." "What about option 4? Called out a voice from the back. It was Jennifer Walsh, who lived on Maple Drive. "We dissolve the HOA and everyone goes their own way." "That's not a viable option," Brenda said. "Why not? If we don't own anything, what's the point?" Gerald stood up. "The HOA still owns the community center building, the playground equipment, and has responsibility for the landscaping and entrance monument. Plus, there are the covenants and restrictions in everyone's deeds. Those covenants reference HOA ownership of common areas, Jennifer shot back. If that ownership doesn't exist, maybe the covenants aren't enforceable either. Rachel Morrison, the attorney, intervened. That's actually a complicated question. The covenants are separate from the ownership issue. They're restrictions that run with the land, attached to individual deeds. They might remain enforceable even if the HOA's ownership claims are problematic. Might, someone yelled. We need certainty, not might. The meeting went on for 3 hours. People were angry, scared, and turning on each other. Neighbors who'd been friendly for years argued about property values, liability, and who was to blame. I finally stood up. Look, we can fight about this forever, but we need to make a decision. The longer we wait, the worse this gets. Personally, I vote we petition the county to take the streets. We lose some control, but we also lose the liability and the massive legal bills. Easy for you to say, Brenda snapped. Some of us have spent years building this community. We have standards here. Standards don't matter if nobody can sell their house because the title is clouded, Marcus said, standing next to me. I'm with Connor. Let the county take the streets. The room split into factions, arguing loudly. Brenda tried to restore order but failed. Eventually, she scheduled the official vote for the following week and adjourned the meeting. As people filed out, I heard Patricia Morris talking to Gerald by the door. This is a disaster. 3 board members have already resigned. Nobody wants the liability. Should we resign too? Gerald asked. And leave Brenda in charge alone. That might be worse. Walking home, I felt exhausted. My quiet suburban life had turned into a legal nightmare and I couldn't see any good way out. The week before the vote, things spiraled even further out of control. Someone, and nobody could prove who, put up a massive banner at the entrance to Meadowbrook Estates. Welcome to nowhere. Streets not legally recognized. The county made them take it down, but not before it went viral on social media. Then, property values started dropping. Real estate sites started showing title issues warnings on Meadowbrook Estates listings. 3 pending sales fell through when buyers couldn't get financing due to title insurance problems. My real estate agent called me, panicked. Connor, the title insurance company is preparing to notify every homeowner in Meadowbrook Estates that they may have inadequate coverage for the property due to the ownership discrepancies. This is going to tank your property values even more. How much are we talking? Preliminary estimates suggest 15 to 20% drops if this doesn't get resolved quickly. I did the math in my head. My house was worth about $300,000. That was potentially $60,000 gone. The neighborhood was in full crisis mode now. The vote had drawn attention from multiple news outlets. The local city council was holding emergency meetings about whether to intervene. State legislators were asking questions about how this happened and why nobody caught it sooner. And then Brenda did something that changed everything. I got a call from Marcus on Thursday night. You need to see this. Brenda's Facebook post. I opened my laptop and navigated to her page. There, in a long, rambling post, Brenda had outlined a plan to save Meadowbrook Estates from outside interference. She proposed that the HOA should claim adverse possession of the streets based on 28 years of continuous maintenance and control. But that wasn't the crazy part. We must also defend our community from those who would tear it down from within, she'd written. I propose immediate liens on the properties of homeowners who have signed the dissolution petition, to be released only when they withdraw their signatures and recommit to our community standards. The post had erupted into hundreds of comments, most of them horrified. She can't do that, Marcus said when I called him. She absolutely cannot do that, I agreed. That's extortion and she doesn't have the authority anyway. The board would need to vote on any liens. But Brenda, it seemed, was beyond caring about proper procedures. The next morning, several homeowners received official-looking letters on HOA letterhead, informing them that liens had been filed against their properties for violations of community solidarity and attempted dissolution of community standards. I wasn't one of the recipients, but Jennifer Walsh was. She called me, furious. "This is insane. She's threatening to destroy my credit and tank my property sale because I signed a petition. This has to be illegal." "It is illegal," I said. "You should call the HOA attorney, Rachel Morrison. She needs to know what Brenda's doing." Jennifer did exactly that. By that afternoon, Rachel had sent a cease and desist letter to Brenda, copied to all board members, stating in no uncertain terms that the liens were unauthorized, potentially fraudulent, and needed to be withdrawn immediately. Brenda's response was to call an emergency board meeting, closed to general members, for that evening. But Marcus and I weren't about to let that slide. We showed up at the community center at 6 o'clock, along with about 30 other homeowners. Brenda tried to lock us out. "This is a closed board meeting. Not when you're discussing illegal liens against community members," I said. "We have a right to hear what's being decided." Gerald, looking miserable in his bow tie, unlocked the door. "Let them in, Brenda. This has gone too far." Inside, the board members looked shell-shocked. Patricia had clearly been crying. Two other board members I barely knew, Susan Callahan and Tom Drake, sat with their arms crossed, looking angry. "Brenda, you need to withdraw these liens immediately," Tom said once we'd all settled in. "You filed them without board approval, without legal counsel, and based on grounds that don't exist in our bylaws or covenants." "I did what was necessary to protect this community," Brenda said, her voice shaking. "You're all too weak to do what needs to be done." "What needs to be done is solving the street ownership issue legally," Susan said, "not attacking our own neighbors." "They were trying to destroy the HOA," Brenda insisted. "They have every right to petition for changes," Rachel Morrison said. She'd arrived minutes after us. "Mrs. Patterson, what you've done is potentially criminal. Filing false liens is a crime in Indiana. You could be charged with fraud, extortion, and abuse of process." The room went silent. "I was protecting property values," Brenda said, but her voice had lost its conviction. "You've destroyed property values," Gerald said quietly. "As treasurer, I can tell you that 4 different title insurance companies have now flagged Meadowbrook Estates as high risk due to the ownership issues, and now your unauthorized liens. We've gone from a solvable problem to a crisis." "I move that we remove Brenda Patterson from the board immediately," Patricia said, her voice stronger than I'd heard it all night. "And I move that we authorize Rachel to withdraw all liens filed in the past 48 hours and issue public apologies to affected homeowners." "Second," Tom said immediately. The vote was unanimous except for Brenda, who sat frozen in her chair. "You can't do this," she whispered. "I built this community." "You nearly destroyed it," Susan said. "Please leave, Brenda." I watched as Brenda gathered her things, moving like she was underwater. For just a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. She'd spent years of her life on this HOA, and it had consumed her so completely that she couldn't see past it. But then, I remembered Jennifer Walsh's panicked phone call about the lien threatening her credit, and the sympathy evaporated. After Brenda left, the remaining board members and Rachel got to work. The liens were withdrawn that night, with official letters sent to all affected parties. Public apologies were posted on the HOA website and Facebook group. "Now," Gerald said, loosening his bow tie, "we still need to deal with the actual problem. The vote is in 3 days. We need to present a united recommendation." The discussion that followed was calmer and more productive than any HOA meeting I'd attended. Without Brenda's constant need to control every detail, people actually listened to each other. By the end of the night, the board had agreed to recommend option 2, petitioning the county to accept the streets as public roads. It was the cheapest option. It removed the liability from homeowners, and it would clear up the title issues quickly. "We'll lose control over some things," Patricia acknowledged, "but we keep the community center, the playgrounds, and the entrance landscaping. We keep the covenants about property maintenance and aesthetics. We just lose the streets themselves." "Which we never legally owned anyway," Marcus pointed out. "Exactly," Rachel said. "And frankly, having the county maintain the streets to proper public standards will likely improve property values over time, not hurt them." The vote the following Tuesday was decisive. Out of 347 households in Meadowbrook Estates, 289 voted. The result was 212 in favor of petitioning the county to accept the streets, 53 against, and 24 abstaining. Rachel Morrison immediately began the process of preparing the petition. It required surveys confirming the streets met county standards, environmental clearances, and agreements about ongoing maintenance responsibilities during the transition period. "This will take several months," she warned us. "The county will need to inspect everything, verify the infrastructure meets their codes, and go through their internal approval process. But assuming everything checks out, by this time next year, you should have county-owned and maintained streets." Life in Meadowbrook Estates slowly returned to something resembling normal over the next few months. The trash company reinstated service once Rachel provided them with documentation of the pending county transfer. The power company fixed the street lights under a temporary maintenance agreement. The pothole on Birch Drive got patched by a county crew as a goodwill gesture. But the real drama wasn't quite over. In early June, 2 months after Brenda's removal from the board, Jennifer Walsh called me again. "Connor, you're not going to believe this. Brenda's been arrested." "What?" "For the liens?" "Partly. But it's bigger than that. The prosecutor's office started investigating after those victims filed complaints. Turns out Brenda's been embezzling from the HOA for the past 3 years. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach." "How much?" "Gerald's doing a full audit now, but initial estimates are around $75,000. The news hit the community like a bomb. Gerald called an emergency meeting to explain what they'd found. Brenda had been making unauthorized withdrawals from the HOA accounts, disguised as community improvement expenses and professional consulting fees. She'd been paying herself nearly $2,000 a month for work she was supposed to be doing as a volunteer. "This explains why our reserves were lower than they should have been," Gerald said, looking devastated. "I trusted her. She was the president. I approved expenses she claimed were legitimate." "Did you see invoices?" someone asked. She provided invoices from a consulting company called Meadowbrook Community Services. I didn't realize it was a shell company she'd created herself. The county prosecutor, a no-nonsense woman named Diana Fletcher, took the case seriously. Brenda was charged with multiple counts of theft, fraud, and corrupt business practices. The HOA was listed as the victim, and Rachel Morrison worked with the prosecutor's office to provide documentation. I attended the preliminary hearing, curious to see how Brenda would handle it. She looked smaller somehow, diminished without her clipboard and pearl necklace. Her attorney, a public defender who looked overworked and underpaid, argued for leniency. My client dedicated years of her life to serving her community, he said. She made poor choices, but she believed she was entitled to compensation for her extensive volunteer work. She stole $75,000, Deanna Fletcher replied. That's not poor choices. That's systematic theft over multiple years. The judge set bail at $25,000 and scheduled a trial date for September. As summer progressed, the county's review of Meadowbrook Estates infrastructure moved forward. Engineers inspected the streets, checking the pavement quality, drainage systems, and conformity to county codes. Environmental specialists verified that all the stormwater management systems met current regulations. There were a few hiccups. 2 sections of Oakmont Circle needed repaving to meet county standards. The storm drains on Sycamore Lane required upgrades. But overall, the infrastructure was in decent shape. Ironically, Rachel told us at a community update meeting, the HOA's maintenance over the years, funded by your dues, kept the streets in good enough condition that the county is willing to accept them. If they'd fallen into disrepair, this would be much harder. The total cost for the necessary upgrades and the legal process came to about $48,000. With the money Brenda had stolen, the HOA reserves were depleted. The board voted to assess each household a special one-time fee of $150 to cover the costs. People grumbled, but paid. We all understood that this was still far cheaper than the alternative. By August, the county had tentatively approved acceptance of the streets, pending final council approval. The local news covered the story as a rare positive outcome to a bureaucratic nightmare. Meanwhile, Brenda's trial had been scheduled for the 3rd week of September. She'd rejected a plea deal that would have given her 3 years probation and required her to pay restitution. Instead, she insisted on going to trial, claiming she'd done nothing wrong. I took a day off work to attend the trial. The courtroom was packed with residents of Meadowbrook Estates. Some came to support Brenda, but most came to see justice done. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Deanna Fletcher presented bank records showing the systematic withdrawals, invoices from the fake consulting company, and testimony from forensic accountants who traced where the money went. It turned out Brenda had used HOA funds to pay for her daughter's college tuition, a kitchen renovation, and a timeshare in Florida. Gerald testified, explaining how he'd trusted Brenda's representations about the expenses. Patricia testified about Brenda's increasingly controlling behavior on the board. Rachel Morrison testified about the unauthorized liens and Brenda's refusal to follow proper procedures. Brenda's defense was that she'd believed she was entitled to compensation for her work, and that the HOA had benefited from her leadership. Her attorney presented testimony from a few neighbors who still supported her, saying she'd kept property values up and maintained standards. But when the prosecution presented evidence that Brenda had known the payments were improper because she'd hidden them from the rest of the board and created a fake company to disguise them, the defense collapsed. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, guilty on all counts. At sentencing 2 weeks later, the judge was not sympathetic. "Mrs. Patterson, you held a position of trust in your community. You were elected to serve your neighbors, not to enrich yourself. You stole from the people who trusted you, and when confronted, you attempted to retaliate against community members through fraudulent liens. This court takes such breaches of trust seriously." Brenda was sentenced to 4 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 2 years. She was also ordered to pay full restitution of $75,000 plus interest, and to forfeit the timeshare property purchased with stolen funds. As they led her away in handcuffs, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that justice had been served. Sadness that someone had destroyed her own life over money and control. And lingering anger at the chaos she'd caused in our community. Outside the courthouse, Marcus and I stood in the autumn sunshine, processing what we'd witnessed. "Well," Marcus said, "that's the end of an era." "Good riddance to it," I said. The county officially accepted ownership of Meadowbrook Estates streets on October 15th. There was no ceremony, just a notice in the mail informing us that our streets were now public roads, maintained by the County Public Works Department. Property values stabilized almost immediately. Title insurance companies removed their warnings. The 3 sales that had fallen through earlier in the year were back on track, with new buyers at only slightly reduced prices. The HOA itself underwent a transformation. Gerald remained as treasurer, but Patricia stepped down as secretary, saying she needed a break. New board members were elected, including Marcus, who I'd encouraged to run. The new board had a completely different philosophy. They reduced dues by 40% now that street maintenance was no longer the HOA's responsibility. They focused on maintaining the community center and common areas, but stopped the obsessive enforcement of minor violations. "We're here to serve the community, not rule it," Marcus said at his first board meeting as a member. "If someone's grass is a little long or their mailbox is slightly crooked, that's not worth creating conflict over." The Facebook group, which had been a constant source of drama, became boring in the best possible way. People posted about garage sales, recommended contractors, and shared photos of lost pets. The angry debates about property standards largely disappeared. I was raking leaves one Saturday afternoon in late November when a car pulled up. Jennifer Walsh got out, smiling. "Connor, I wanted to thank you. My house sale finally closed yesterday. The buyers had no issues with the title because everything's clean now." "That's great, Jennifer. I'm happy for you. I know you pushed for the county takeover option from the beginning, even when people were fighting about it. You were right." "We all figured it out together," I said. "Well, eventually," she laughed. "After nearly destroying ourselves first, but yeah, eventually." After she drove away, I stood in my front yard looking at the neighborhood. The street lights worked. The streets were smooth, having been properly maintained. The entrance landscaping looked nice, but not obsessively manicured. Kids played basketball in driveways without worrying about noise complaints. It looked like a normal, healthy suburban neighborhood. Which, after everything we'd been through, felt like a miracle. That December, the new HOA board organized a holiday party at the community center. It was the first community event since the whole mess began, and nobody was sure if people would come. They came in droves. The community center was packed with neighbors who hadn't spoken in months, reconnecting over cookies and punch. There was laughter, actual genuine laughter, instead of the tense anxiety that had dominated every gathering for the past year. Marcus found me by the refreshments table. Not bad for a neighborhood that didn't legally exist a year ago. "We're official now, county roads and everything." Gerald told me the restitution payments from Brenda's assets came through. The HOA recovered about $30,000 so far. They're putting it toward new playground equipment. "Something positive out of all that mess," I said. "Hey, did you hear? The city council is introducing new regulations requiring verification of property ownership for all common areas in private subdivisions. They're calling it the Meadowbrook Law." I shook my head, smiling. At least some good came out of our disaster. Other neighborhoods won't have to go through what we did. Later that evening, as the party wound down, Gerald made a short speech. He thanked everyone for sticking together through a difficult year, acknowledged the mistakes that had been made, and expressed optimism for the future. "We learned a hard lesson," he said, "about the importance of oversight, transparency, and not letting any one person have too much control. But we also learned that this community is strong enough to survive its own stupidity." Everyone laughed at that. So here's to the future. To county-maintained streets, reasonable HOA dues, and neighbors who look out for each other instead of measuring each other's mailbox positions. People raised their cups in a toast. I found myself standing next to Tom Drake, one of the board members who'd voted to remove Brenda. "You think we're really past it?" I asked him. "All the drama and fighting?" "I hope so," Tom said. "But I'll tell you what, I'm never taking proper property records for granted again." First thing I did after we got the county takeover approved was verify that the community center building's deed is properly filed and clear. And it is, thank God. At least that's one crisis we don't have to deal with. As I walked home that night, past houses decorated with Christmas lights, I reflected on what a strange and stressful year it had been. We discovered that our streets didn't legally exist. We'd nearly torn apart our community fighting about what to do. We'd uncovered embezzlement and watched our HOA president get arrested. Property values had tanked and recovered. The whole thing had been covered by national news as a cautionary tale about bureaucratic oversights, but we'd survived. The streets were now properly owned by the county. The embezzled funds were being recovered. Brenda was in prison, paying for her crimes. The HOA had reformed itself into something functional and reasonable. Property values were back to normal. And most importantly, Meadowbrook Estates felt like a community again, instead of a dictatorship with a clipboard. My house looked warm and welcoming with its modest Christmas lights. The mailbox was still probably 3 inches to the left of where Brenda had insisted it should be, but nobody cared anymore. The grass was at a reasonable height. The shutters were a perfectly acceptable shade of blue. Inside, I poured myself a drink and settled onto the couch. My phone buzzed with a notification from the neighborhood Facebook group. Someone had posted a photo from the holiday party with the caption, "To better days ahead in Meadowbrook Estates." The comments were full of agreement and friendly banter. No arguments about rules, no threats of fines. No drama, just neighbors being neighborly. I raised my glass to the empty room. To better days ahead. The next morning, I woke up to find fresh snow covering everything. The county snowplow had already been through, clearing the streets efficiently. In the old days, we would have waited for the HOA's contracted service, which sometimes took until mid-afternoon. I was scraping my windshield when Marcus came out to do the same. "County services aren't so bad," he called over. "Told you," I said. We'd all been skeptical about giving up control to the county, worried that service would be slow and we'd lose the ability to manage our own neighborhood. But it turned out that professional municipal services were actually pretty good. The streets got plowed promptly. Potholes were filled quickly. When a water main broke on Maple Drive in January, the county had crews there within an hour. The HOA would have had to call a contractor, get quotes, approve the expense, and probably would have taken days to fix it. Life settled into a comfortable routine through the winter and spring. The HOA board met quarterly instead of monthly, dealing with minor issues around the community center and entrance landscaping. Marcus reported that the meetings rarely lasted more than an hour and were drama-free. "It's almost boring," he said, "but in a good way." "Boring is underrated," I agreed. In March, I got a letter from the county assessor's office. I opened it nervously, remembering that the whole mess had started with a survey crew sent by the county for tax assessment purposes. But the letter was straightforward. My property value was assessed at $295,000, actually up slightly from the previous year. The ownership of the streets was no longer listed as questionable. Everything was clean and clear. I saved that letter in my files, a tangible reminder that the nightmare was truly over. By April, Brenda's case had faded from everyone's mind except as an occasional cautionary tale. The money she'd stolen had been largely recovered through asset forfeitures and her restitution payments. The HOA was financially stable with reasonable dues and no debt. Then I got an unexpected call from Deanna Fletcher, the prosecutor who'd handled Brenda's case. "Mr. Kimball, I wanted to inform you that Brenda Patterson has filed an appeal of her conviction." My stomach dropped. "On what grounds?" "Her new attorney is arguing that the HOA's lack of clear legal ownership of the common areas means the HOA wasn't a proper legal entity, and therefore she couldn't have stolen from it." "That's absurd. The HOA existed as a legal entity even if our ownership of the streets was unclear." "I agree, and I believe the appeal will fail. The HOA was properly incorporated, had bylaws, held elections, and collected dues. The street ownership issue doesn't negate the organization's existence. But I wanted you to be aware that this isn't completely over." The news spread quickly through the neighborhood. Most people were confident the appeal would fail, but there was lingering anxiety. What if the judge agreed with Brenda's argument? What if she got out of prison and came back to Meadowbrook Estates? Rachel Morrison assured us at a community meeting that the appeal had virtually no chance of success. "The legal theories her attorney is advancing are creative but baseless. The HOA's status as a legal entity was never in question, only the ownership of specific property. Two completely different issues." The appellate court heard arguments in May. I didn't attend this time, trusting Rachel's assessment. Marcus went and reported back. It didn't go well for Brenda's side. The judges asked tough questions about how the street ownership issue could possibly affect the HOA's status as a corporation. Her attorney didn't have good answers. The ruling came down 2 weeks later. Appeal denied. The court's opinion was scathing, calling Brenda's legal arguments without merit and an attempt to evade responsibility through legal sophistry. Brenda would serve her full sentence. I was relieved when I heard, but also ready to move on completely. The story of Meadowbrook Estates and its streets that belonged to nobody had consumed more than a year of my life. It was time to let it go and just enjoy living in a normal neighborhood. That summer was blissfully uneventful. I worked in my garden, went to a few cookouts with neighbors, and attended exactly one HOA meeting where the most controversial topic was whether to replace the mulch in the common area flower beds with river rock. "Much lower maintenance," Susan argued. "But mulch looks more natural," someone countered. They took a vote. Mulch won by a narrow margin, and that was it. No shouting, no accusations, no threats, just a civil disagreement resolved democratically. Walking home afterward, I marveled at how different it felt from the chaotic meetings of the previous year. In August, I was checking my mail when I saw a moving truck on Sycamore Lane. New neighbors were moving in. I walked over to introduce myself. A young couple in their late 20s were directing movers. The woman saw me approaching and smiled. "Hi, I'm Felicity Thompson, and this is my husband James. We just bought the house." "Connor Kimball, welcome to Meadowbrook Estates." "Thanks, we're excited. The neighborhood seems really nice." "It is now," I said, then caught myself. "I mean, it's always been nice. We had some excitement last year, but things have settled down." "Oh, we heard about that," James said. "The real estate agent mentioned something about a title issue that got resolved." "Yeah, something like that." "All cleared up now. The streets are county-owned, the HOA is reasonable, and the neighbors are friendly. You picked a good time to move in." They seemed satisfied with that answer. I didn't see the need to tell them the full crazy story. New beginnings deserved clean slates. Over the next few weeks, I watched Felicity and James settle into the neighborhood. They came to a community cookout, joined the Facebook group, and seemed to fit right in. Nobody mentioned Brenda or the street ownership crisis to them. That chapter was closed. One evening in early September, I was sitting on my porch watching the sunset when Gerald walked by on his evening stroll. He paused and came up to say hello. "Beautiful evening," he said. "Sure is. How's retirement treating you?" Gerald had stepped down as HOA treasurer in July, saying it was time for someone else to take over. "Wonderfully boring," he said with a smile. "The new treasurer, Amy Chen, is doing a great job. Very organized, very transparent. Everything I should have been when Brenda was running wild." "You were dealing with someone actively deceiving you. That's not your fault." "I appreciate that, but I still should have been more diligent. Anyway, I didn't stop by to rehash the past. I wanted to tell you that I think you handled everything really well last year. You kept a level head when a lot of us were panicking, and you pushed for the right solution even when it wasn't popular. I just wanted my house title to be clear and my property value to stop tanking," I said honestly. Gerald laughed. "Well, mission accomplished. Property values are back up, titles are clear, and we have a functional HOA that doesn't terrorize its members. I'd call that a success." After he left, I sat thinking about his words. It had been a success, ultimately. We'd faced a genuine crisis and come through it intact. Yes, we'd stumbled along the way. Yes, we'd discovered corruption and fought among ourselves. But in the end, we'd solved the problem and come out stronger. The streets of Meadowbrook Estates now belong to someone, the county. The HOA still existed, but focused on reasonable community maintenance instead of authoritarian control. Property values were stable, neighbors were friendly, and I no longer dreaded seeing an HOA board member walking toward my house. As autumn arrived and the leaves began to change, I found myself genuinely appreciating the neighborhood I lived in. The tree-lined streets were beautiful. The houses were well maintained without being obsessively uniform. Kids played outside. People walked their dogs and waved to each other. It looked like the peaceful suburban community I'd thought I was buying into 2.5 years ago. It had just taken a journey through bureaucratic limbo, embezzlement, arrest, and complete HOA reform to get there. On the first anniversary of the day those surveyors showed up at the entrance, Marcus organized a small gathering at his house. Nothing official, just a few neighbors who'd been particularly involved in the whole saga. Jennifer Walsh was there, having decided not to sell after all once the crisis passed. Tom and Susan from the board came. Gerald showed up with homemade cookies. Even Rachel Morrison stopped by for an hour between other appointments. We sat on Marcus's deck, drinking beer and reminiscing about the crazy year we'd had. "Remember when Brenda tried to file those bogus liens?" Jennifer said, shaking her head. "I was so angry I could barely see straight." "Remember the news crews camped out at the entrance?" Tom added. "My mom in Florida called me panicking because she saw our neighborhood on national news." "I still can't believe nobody caught the ownership issue for 28 years, Susan said. "How does that even happen? Bureaucratic assumptions and nobody asking the right questions," Rachel said. "It happens more often than you'd think. Meadowbrook Estates isn't even the only subdivision in Indiana with this problem. Since your story went public, 3 other communities have discovered similar issues. At least they can learn from our experience," I said. "The Meadowbrook law is helping too," Rachel noted. That new city regulation requiring verification of common area ownership has already caught 2 problematic subdivisions before they became crisis situations. We talked into the evening, the conversation gradually shifting from past drama to present contentment. Everyone seemed genuinely happy with how things had turned out. As I walked home that night, I passed the community center where so many heated meetings had taken place. The lights were off, the parking lot empty. Inside that building, we'd yelled at each other, voted on crucial decisions, and watched our HOA president get removed from office. But we'd also come together as a community when it mattered. We'd made the hard choice to give up some control for the greater good. We'd held a corrupt leader accountable. We'd reformed our institutions to be more transparent and democratic. The streets I walked on were properly owned and maintained now. The property deed in my filing cabinet was clear of clouds. The HOA served the community instead of ruling it, and Brenda Patterson was in prison, paying for her crimes. It wasn't the quiet suburban life I'd imagined when I moved to Meadowbrook Estates. But somehow, having gone through all that drama and come out the other side, I felt more connected to this place and these people than I ever would have otherwise. My house came into view, looking exactly as it should. The mailbox was still 3 inches to the left, and I smiled every time I saw it. A small act of defiance against the tyranny that used to rule this neighborhood. I unlocked my door, stepped inside, and felt genuinely at home, not just in my house, but in my neighborhood. In Meadowbrook Estates, where the streets finally belonged to someone, the HOA had learned humility, and neighbors looked out for each other instead of measuring each other's grass. It had taken a crisis to get here, but we'd arrived at a good place, and I was content to stay. The story of the neighborhood whose streets belonged to nobody had ended. The story of a genuine community built from the ashes of that crisis was just beginning, and I was happy to be part of it.